Hello everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Here to Stay Baby, a Northern Intersectional Caucus. Thank you for joining us for Neo-Fascism, the Rise of Modern Fascism in Northern Communities. My name is Reuben Brown, and I am one of the co-presidents of Black Lives Matter Sudbury. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that BLM Sudbury is located in Neswagma, later known as Sudbury. This land on which we learn, work, and live is located on the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabe and the Wampatay First Nation in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. We would also like to recognize the presence and important contributions of Métis people in the community and on this land. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that February marks Black History Month. While oppression, discrimination, and systemic injustices cannot be diminished to just 1 month a year, it is important to recognize this time as an opportunity to educate yourself, your family, and your friends on the historic contributions of the Black communities in Turtle Island. We would also like to take a moment to thank our conference sponsors. It is because of their generosity that we have been able to thrive and present important programming like this caucus within our northern communities. Our moderator for this panel is Reuben Roth, an associate professor in the Workplace and Labor Studies program at Laurentian University and faculty of the Sociology Department. Our panel consists of Jude Alexander, Gary Kinsman, Laurie McGauley, and Morin. Welcome everyone. Biographies for our panel participants and a full list of conference sponsors can be found in our event booklet. We are pleased to offer ASL interpretation for each panel provided by the Canadian Hearing Services. Following this panel, all attendees will receive a feedback survey that can be filled out for a chance to win a prize pack of items showcasing the designs of our caucus artist, Sonia Katini. Thank you everyone for your participation in Neo-Fascism, the Rise of Modern Fascism in Northern Communities. Without further ado, here is your moderator, Reuben Roth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Neo-Fascism, the Rise of Modern Fascism in Northern Communities. I'd like to introduce our panelists. You've already heard their names, but let's go around the room and have them tell us about themselves. Let's start with Gary Kinsman.
Hi, I'm really pleased to be able to be on this panel, and I want to thank Black Lives Matter Sudbury for inviting me. You can read what's in the caucus book about me, but I also thought I'd just mention some of the ways I've been involved in fighting against racism and fascism. So I remember in the early 1980s, as a member of Gay Liberation Against the Right Everywhere in Toronto, speaking at a rally against the KKK. The KKK in the early 1980s was trying to regain a foothold in Toronto, and we mobilized against them. Gay Liberation Against the Right Everywhere was a group that was focused on fighting the moral conservative right wing that we mostly focused on its anti-feminist and anti-queer character, but it was also intensely racist. In Sudbury, I helped and assisted with the organization of Anti-Racist Action in the late 1990s, which was an anti-fascist organization. It was an amazing organization. It didn't last long. It had up to 200 people at meetings, mostly high school students. Most recently, I've been involved in anti-fascist, anti-racist organizing in Toronto against a sort of very motley alliance of various groups, including the Soldiers of Odin and its various permutations, the Yellow Vests, which has a presence in Sudbury, and also a group that called the Jewish Defense League, which is a very far-right pro-Israeli group that is engaged in murders and brutality against people and is actually considered a very dangerous organization in many places. Anyway, it exists in uneasy alliance with the other parts of the right wing because of their extreme and overt anti-Semitism. I just wanted to mention one thing about what we did in 2019. In 2019, the fascists and right wing had a mobilization where their intention was to actually get to the Pride Parade area. It was actually the day of the Dyke March. And they were escorted and protected by the police in terms of trying to do that. We had to stop them. We had to defend the mosque on the way in terms of their march. And a number of anti-fascists actually got beaten up by fascists in the Eaton Center building. But we were successful in stopping them. But I just wanted to also relay one of the chants we used to freak out the right wing and the racists and fascists who were there. And this was sung, this was chanted by everyone at the event, and regardless of their sexuality. And part of the slogan was queer sex all night long. And that certainly did upset the fascists and racists. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Moving right along to Laurie McGauley. Laurie, can you tell us something about yourself?
After that introduction, mine will be very short. Yeah, I'm Laurie Magali. I've been in Sudbury in Northern Ontario for most of my life. So I guess part of what I'd like to say about my contributions today is that I'm actually coming at it from obviously my standpoint, which is a white, working class, cisgendered, heterosexual woman who's been living in Northern Ontario all my life. And as I've come to understand white supremacy and neo-fascism, I've come to understand my own privilege, of course, in not seeing it before this. So anyway, I'll just stop there. I just wanted to indicate where I was coming from this discussion. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Laurie. Jude Alexander, can you tell us something about yourself?
Hi, I'm Jude. I'm born and raised in Sudbury. I have not actually personally been very active, or as much as a lot of the other people in these panels have been, in participating in a lot of protests or a lot of other actions. I think I've been asked here specifically because on social media I'm very active, consistently writing and posting things about just racial equity and queer rhetoric, and in this context, the rise of fascism in northern communities. And yeah, I'm a little nervous because I feel like a lot of people have way more experience in this kind of context than I do, but I'm happy to be here regardless.
Thank you, Jude. Everybody brings something to the table, and I know you do too. So, and our next panelist, last but not least, Will Morin. Will, tell us something about yourself.
Hi everybody, Ani bonjour. My name is Will. That's my income tax name is Will Morin. But my spirit name is North Facing Wolf, and Wolf is my clan, Maingendodam. My traditional territory that my mom and her ancestors are from is the eastern shores of Lake Superior, Michipagwadaranga, Nojaba. You know of as near Wawa, Michipacotton. But I moved here after I was born, the youngest of seven, and into Sudbury, where I was raised. My father French, my mom's Ojibwe, so I'm a bit kind of beside myself. But that reality is that as a person of mixed ancestry, I'm not brown, I'm not white, I'm bright. And I celebrate that for those of us that are of mixed ancestry. We gather that power from that reality of our circumstance. When it comes to dealing with the topic of this panel, I served in the armed forces 30 years ago during the first Gulf War, and prior to that was the Oka crisis. And it was that Oka crisis that I was, as a soldier, I was a medic in the armed forces, that I began to realize that I can't be spending my time any longer in the army if the army itself were the oppressors of the people in which my ancestry are related to. And so I left that and began a journey. But the thing is, that journey that I've been on is a struggle, but I realized I wasn't alone. And seeing the work that Laurie has done and Gary have done when I was younger, it was that they are individuals, are pure allies of celebrating the fact that wrong is wrong. No matter what color it comes from, it's wrong. And I've seen it manifest itself in many different aspects of my own personal journey. And so very honored and humbled to be here, to be sharing the panel with my two heroes. And Jude, you're not alone in recognizing that sometimes there is stuff that you have to share that we can all learn from. So miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you, Will. Let me set the stage for a moment and just let you know where we're starting. The political economy of some advanced capitalist liberal democracies resemble many aspects of fascism. However, white supremacy, genocide, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing are entirely compatible with neo-colonization within capitalism. In recent years, Canada has seen a significant rise in the mainstreaming of extremist voices and racist conversations. So we're going to kick it off with our first question and I'm going to go around the room to each panelist, and here's where we begin to take on colonialism. So the first question, from your perspective, what do capitalist liberal democracies and modern neo-fascism and white supremacy look like in the Northern context? Gary, can we begin with you?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I think there's something quite distinctive about the ways in which white supremacy and racist organizing takes place in the North that we have to recognize. It has the same characteristics as in other parts of Turtle Island and what's called Canada. Its basis is white supremacy and support for colonialism. And it shares, an incredible opposition to anyone trying to organize for the rights and liberation of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. It shares with racist right wing all across the Canadian state an incredible opposition to immigrants, refugees, and migrants, especially people trying to come from the global South. But it has a particular character in terms of its intense opposition to Indigenous people and Indigenous struggles because of the particular histories of the North and the role that colonialism and settler colonialism played there. So I want to just mark that as sort of a distinctive feature of organizing against white supremacy and the fascist right wing in the North, which is the centrality of taking up the defense of Indigenous people and Indigenous struggles. The problems that we're encountering when we deal with the racist right wing are not simply the racist right wing. We actually have to look at where it comes from, what fosters it, what develops it in terms of the forms of racism and settler colonialism that define at its very foundations the Canadian state and Canadian social formation. So we have to recognize that. We also have to recognize the particular features that takes in the context of neoliberal capitalist societies like we live in. So there's a shared opposition and support for shared opposition to struggles for Black and Indigenous and people of color's freedom. There's support for settler colonialism in various different ways. It can take more liberal and more overtly racist forms. There's a shared support for law and order, which includes support for the police and military. And we have to actually ask, why are the police and military so infested with groups like the Proud Boys and other white supremacist and fascist organizations? And why do those organizations so often defend the police? So we have to see that the roots of the problem are not in these right-wing groups themselves, they're actually in the social fabric of a racist, colonialist, capitalist society. And we have to see that as the major basis of what we need to fight against. We need to transform the social relations of this society as a whole. We need to stand on the side of Indigenous people and Black and other people of color in terms of their freedom movements. But we also have to understand there's a distinct threat that these fascist right-wing groups, like the Soldiers of Odin and its permutations, like the Yellow Vests, that they actually present, because their sort of operation in this context is to specifically go after those of us who are organizing for social justice and for freedom. Their targets can include Black Lives Matter in various places. They certainly do. Queer and trans activists, Indigenous activists, and anti-fascist activists ourselves, right? So it's this particular role they play in trying to combat and weaken what we're able to accomplish in terms of our organizing. So we can't minimize their distinct threat. And it's really important, I think, for us to understand that we cannot rely on the police or the state in terms of our struggles against these groups, because more often than not, they will actually protect them and protect their supposed right to free speech. I support anti-fascist organizing, and I support the position of no platform for fascists. And this is not a question of free speech. because fascists and right-wing white supremacists are organizing to deny people of color and oppressed people their right to free speech, and they're organizing in action concrete harms against oppressed people in our society. So it's important for us to not rely on the state and the police in terms of our fight against them, to actually understand that one of the lessons of history is that we actually have to break up the ability of these groups to organize before they're actually able to succeed in becoming a much stronger mass force. The lessons of organizing against fascism in Germany, in Italy, and many other countries is that the left and social movements did not act to actually break up fascist organizing early enough, allowing it to become a mass force. So we do need to deal with that distinctive problem in the context of the broader relations of settler colonialism and a racist, capitalist, neoliberal society. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. I'm going to go in reverse order next question, but for now, Laurie, I'm giving it to you. What do you think of, from your perspective, what do capitalist liberal democracies and modern neo-fascism and white supremacy look like in the Northern context? Laurie?
Well, I think sort of going off what Gary was talking about, you can't, I'm going to sort of make a distinction between what is sort of normalized white supremacy in our society, because it is normalized, and the more active white supremacy wouldn't have any ground to stand on if we didn't have that. So we just need to look at, the homeless population here in Sudbury. Of course, over 40% of them are made up of Indigenous people on their land. So they are homeless on their own land. And yet that's not a huge issue for us. We just sort of normalize that and we just take that for granted. Another example I'll use is the Robinson-Huron Treaty trial that was taking place in Northern Ontario 2 years ago, where, to be perfectly honest, most people living in Sudbury don't even know they're living on Robinson-Huron Treaty land. So that was a new thing for a lot of people, and yet most people actually weren't interested. The media didn't pay that much attention to this. It was a historical court case, basically claiming that the government was not living up to, the treaty, terms of the treaty. The repercussions of the fact that the Indigenous people won this case actually should be concerning settlers, because it could mean, and it should mean, billions of dollars, and yet it hasn't barely caused a ripple. The only reason that that can happen is because we are so entrenched in white supremacy that we don't actually even think that it could affect us. So that's some of the and I mean, there's a lot more, but that's some of the groundwork that we're working from here. That when we look at what Gary's talking about, which is the more active, organized white supremacist movements that are, fairly new in terms of our history, in terms of hate movements, in terms of my understanding of hate movements, but they're very active. And like Gary says, there's nothing particular about Northern Ontario about these hate movements, except that the ways that they will manifest around these things. So that they are part of a national and, or obviously over Turtle Island, these hate movements are happening. In Northern Ontario, we have absolutely seen the results of these hate groups. They do, as Gary says, they're part of their way of functioning is to go after people who are organizing for social justice issues. Certainly they will target the people who are the activists, but also the people who are BIPOC people themselves. So putting a lot of people in danger, and not in danger so much as threatening them and making sure that they feel threatened. And I think that that's when we then move this discussion over into fascism and neo-fascism. Violence, of course, is at the core of that. And the threat of violence is at the core of that. And this is what we're seeing more and more of in Northern Ontario as well, is this threat of violence towards people who are fighting for social justice issues. So anyway, I'll stop it there, but that's sort of what I see it looking like right now.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. Jude, what does it look like from your standpoint in Northern Ontario? White supremacy, capitalist lib democracies, and modern neo-fascism?
To me, liberalism's commitment to a free market makes it implicitly incapable of fully committing to the left-leaning ideals that it purports to subscribe to. Racial equity is not possible in a capitalist society. I say this because the first and the last rule of capitalism is to exploit. To achieve something, to achieve success in a free market, you have to exploit something or somebody else. As long as this is the paradigm that our society functions on, we will, consciously or not, create, or in Canada's case, consistently maintain, a system where power invariably consolidates in one group of people that then exploits the other. I believe this is clear in almost every step of the history of the politics of Canada. Conservatism fights tooth and nail to preserve or create new castes of people that they can subsequently subjugate, which you may recognize as fascism, while liberalism espouses ideas of equity and change and justice, but then drags their feet with every step of the way once they realize that those ideas necessarily come at their expense. The uncomfortable reality is that as far as Black people are concerned, as far as Indigenous people are concerned, as queer people are concerned, there is little to no appreciable difference between liberalism and neo-fascism. While the systems of oppression they create may operate via different means, the end result is the same: a society where lines are drawn at the intersections of race, among other things, and the people with power position the people without to bear the brunt of the damage caused by the ethical and economic failings of their ideals.
Thank you. Well said. Will, you get to close this off. What's your view from the North?
Two neo-fascists walk into a bar, buy a drink, and call it their own. What part of that is racist? All of it. When I was working on my master's, I was sitting on the stage at Thornlow, which sadly Thornlow has to have that program closed, but the new theater they had created about 10 years ago. I was sitting there with a classmate who the class was covering a number of books. The only text in the course we were taking that was Indigenous was Maria Campbell's Half-Breed. And the student was a non-Indigenous student, but she brought in Oved Mercredi as one of our guest lecturers in the Department of Indigenous Studies to come in and assist in, because he knew Maria Campbell. And when he was speaking, he spoke white man this and white man that, and it offended the instructors. And at the end of his presentation, the instructors asked him, what do you mean by white? And he leaned back in his chair over it. He pondered for a few seconds, and then he said, other than a few canvases on the wall, he says, what on this campus is Indigenous? And there was no answer. And he says, because we're in it. What is white? We're in it. And if we look at the medicine wheel behind me, that is the fundamental flaw. You want to know what neo-fascism is, what racism is, with colonialism? It's actually an adolescent who is like the Viking warring off and behaving the way teenagers do when they're misled and misguided and undervalued in that reality of they don't have the values, they fight. And how do I know? Western history is recorded by their wars. And the only way that the end result of a war is you take from another. And as Jude was saying about the fact of the matter is that you take that from which you want. And when we see the lowing of the attendance at Laurentian University of Canadians, but yet there's a growing population of Indigenous peoples, Laurentian wants to dissolve the Federation and take over the Indigenous Studies courses because that's where the money is. It's that simple. It's that simple. It's where there's opportunism and disadvantage, there isn't a respect. And as Laurie was saying, if you're a Canadian citizen, if you are, put up your hand so I can see it. And if you're out there in the Netherland of cyber world, if you put up your hand and you're a Canadian citizen, then you are a signatory to the treaty. And as such, it's not the rights, it's the responsibilities that you have to make sure that the Crown honor those conditions. And if the Crown doesn't, it's on you. And we have to understand that. But Indigenous peoples are the other side of that treaty signing negotiation and relationship. And when I served in the armed forces, I did so for a number of reasons, but one of them was, now that I've served the crown, I served the crown. The crown I now can hold accountable to serve Indigenous peoples, yet they have. And this is where the problem lies. Neo-fascism is somebody who does not want to take the responsibility, the accountability, and take responsibility for that which they've done to others.
Thank you, Will. Jude, I'm giving you fair warning. This next one is going to you to begin, and Laurie, I'm going to follow with you. So what are the dangers that Northern marginalized people face in the wake of this disturbing trend, this rise of fascism? Jude?
The danger is violence, which, as we've all certainly experienced, manifests in many forms. Our immediate association with the word violence is physical violence. Many of us have firsthand experience with the physical violence that comes with being a person of color or having a queer identity. But there are also more insidious forms of violence that people of color experience constantly. Social denigration, educational and industrial prejudice, medical malpractice even, or etc. As Northern society grows economically lean, it will look to cut corners to make things work. And those corners have always typically been the points of the shape where people of color reside. Perhaps worst of all, one of the most powerful and direct ways that we can combat society's attempts to shift the weight of consequence to us is by demonstration and protest. The things we're doing now, the demonstrations we had past summer, so many of the things that everybody does to fight these things. And the more restless we become, the more we invite direct physical and social violence on ourselves. Doing the right thing in this context paints a target on us, and it saddens me to know that necessarily it will get worse before it gets better.
Thank you, Jude. Laurie, what's your...
Yes, I agree. I'm afraid that I do think it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think, you know, like Jude is saying, this is all about, to some extent, our neoliberal capitalist system. And of course, the way that our current forms of neo-fascism work is that they generate hate. And of course, that is a part of how they implement their agendas, is by distracting the rest of us through hate. So that hate, of course, is what I was trying to say before, is not new. That hate is built into our systems. So of course, the people who are in danger are the people who are already in danger. So I would say that these manifestations of hate that we're seeing, of course, are directed towards women, the Proud Boys, and we need to talk about that. Misogyny is a clear part of all of these movements, but obviously BIPOC people are definitely, absolutely the target of hate. So we can see that anybody who has a lot of this neo-fascist movement, a lot of these neo-fascist movements are, of course, backlash movements. That are, so any groups that have managed to gain any kind of social justice or equality or progress, so LGBTQ two-spirit people, of course, women and BIPOC, are in danger of these neo-fascist movements, and they are in danger of violence and the threat of violence. And so absolutely, those of us who do not belong to those groups have a huge responsibility for making sure that that is stopped as soon as possible, because we can see, certainly in the States, but we can start to see here in Canada that if these things aren't stopped immediately, they do end up taking on a life of their own. And so, yes, I think that means in that sense that who is in danger? We are all in danger, because of course that hate can take off. I'm just going to quickly talk very quickly, talk about the first time I experienced, and again, that's probably a reflection of my own privilege, but the first time I experienced that mass mob feeling of hate moving through a population was with the Mike Harris government. And the hate was directed at poor people and people who lived in poverty. And it was completely legitimized by the media and of course by the Mike Harris government, and that their first campaign, which was basically about how we should all hate poor people because they were the problem, right? They were criminals, and I have to say that feeling going through the population, you could literally feel it. It was, everybody hated poor people. Not everybody, but a good portion of the population were pulled into that. And so it is very easy to get, I wasn't, but you could see my parents' neighbors were. I mean, my mom was getting into arguments with people about this. I mean, it was prevalent. And so hate is a tactic that is very successfully used, certainly by the right wing right now, to distract us and to help them with their agenda, which is, of course, to punish people even further. And those are the same people that are going to be punished. So I'll stop it there. Sorry.
Thank you, Laurie. Well said. Will, how about you? What are the dangers Northern marginalized people face in the wake of this disturbing trend?
Apish mon pi gigadonish na bem win. Gin. Ka? Going? I just asked a phrase in the Ojibwe language, the language that my mom spoke, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law speak, a language that is over 10,000 plus years old. I said in that language, who here speaks the language of the Anishinaabe people? Because we're not in England, we're not in France, we're not in Africa or Asia. And that medicine wheel that you see behind me is an indication of that true core value, is that we had a prophecy 5,000 years ago that predicted what we see on the world today, and in specifically North America, Turtle Island, in that all those cultures would come together equally. But what color is our government? What color is our education? What color is our legal system? That is the problem. When the crown is both the perpetrator and the court system, how do you have justice? There isn't. It doesn't exist. And so the key here is inclusion. But that's where neo-fascism is well, roused and gets them pissed off. Is that when you let them know they have to share. Well, guess what? They need to go back to the kindergarten sandbox, because that's where they would have learned it. Oh, wait, they didn't learn it because it was never where they would have learned. So when you keep taking and you don't want to share, that's the core of a simple human reality. But that phrase that I said in Ojibwe, when I say it, what I'm getting at is, when did the last residential school close? Because the ultimate purpose and the function of the residential school was to reduce Indigenous peoples off the land. The status system was to remove Indigenous peoples from relationship and connection and status and connection to the land. And when you have those two systems in play, it's ultimately about land. Thomas King spoke in his book of The Inconvenient Indian as to the core of what is the foundation of all of this is land. Because land, what we see as Indigenous peoples, is not how land was seen by those coming over that are now what we would call the neo-fascists or colonialists in that mentality, or the capitalists. Because ultimately, they don't see the land as a living being. They see it as a thing. And that value system is diametrically opposite to what the earth needs today. So I'm going to teach you a couple of Ojibwe words. And the word is earth, which is ke. Everyone say ke. Now, I want you to say the word medicine in Ojibwe, and you listen for it, and you tell me something unique about it. This is the Ojibwe word for medicine. Mishke ke. It's a medicine wheel, okay? A language and a teaching and a relationship to the land that is 2 to 3 times older than Europe. And it's telling you in their language, that word, in order for medicine to be achieved, we need to have both feet on the ground walking in balance, because that is medicine. Resource extraction to the point of devastation of land is not balance, is not medicine. And so neo-fascism is a poison. It's not a medicine. And that's its problem, is that it's drunk on its own in toxicity of its righteousness to its poison, not realizing there's not going to be many people left but the foundation of that medicine wheel teaching was about us coming together equally. Until Parliament has more other cultures in there equally, until all industries have more Indigenous and African Americans or Asians coming in to be part of that, so that it's equal. But right now, our education system and the residential school continues. How do I know? You guys don't speak Ojibwe. Because you don't speak Ojibwe, you tell me the education system succeeded. We're continuing to assimilate Indigenous peoples into one cultural color view. So how do you get rid of that? Reduce it and include the others. Include.
Well, thank you for that teaching. Gary, you're going to close off this question. Let us have it.
Okay, so thanks, Jude, Laurie, and Will. I agree with everything that's been said. I wanted to, first of all, just highlight one danger that hasn't been mentioned so far, which is the intersection between anti-maskers around the pandemic and the far right and white supremacists. And we really need to recognize that's a direct threat to lots of people in terms of our safety, but it's also a way in which they're advancing their white supremacist and settler colonial views. I'm sure people are aware of the marches that have been not small in Calgary and Edmonton recently, which have clearly made the white supremacist racist character of the anti-masking movement incredibly clear. So that's another whole set of issues that we have to address. Just quickly, I mean, the dangers that they present are physical violence, social violence, the possibility of outing people to bosses, which is what they tried with some of the people associated with Pride Fierte in Sudbury, the attacks on people on the social media, which creates a whole other terrain for the right wing to attack people. So these are all really important. The danger is, to some extent, that this causes people to withdraw from activism and to not be overt and out and active in our movements, which of course is exactly what they want. They want us to go and hide. They want us to be afraid. And it also means that some of us are thinking that maybe we need to rely on the more respectable racists, the more liberal racists and colonialists. And that's another danger, because they're not protecting us at all, and they're actually facilitating the growth of the right wing. So I think I'll just mention one other danger. They also move the discussion to the right? When you actually see them being seen as having a legitimate point of view, that racism and colonialism somehow is a legitimate point of view. We have to resist that and undermine that and take that apart, because that will be really dangerous if the terrain of discussion moves so far to the right that our concerns once again become marginalized and almost invisible. I'll just leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. And that closes off round two. We're going with our third question. And Jude, I'm going to start off with you, I think. So have a rise in extreme right-wing capitalism or neo-fascism altered the narrative of activism in northern communities? Jude?
To be honest, I think the altered narrative is the idea of extreme capitalism or of a new kind of fascism. These ideals are deeply embedded in the very fabric of this country and always have been. Maybe not in these lands, but definitely in the country that, has claimed them. The difficulties that marginalized people in our communities face is not a new shocking trend. It's the tail end of centuries of oppression, like centuries, significantly longer than any of us have been here. I believe that the reason that our particular generation's activism feels more immediately urgent is that we realize that racial equity necessarily coincides with economic equity and environmental justice. Sorry if it sounds like fear-mongering, but the reality is that we physically cannot survive the consequences of the society we live in. We have less than a century to produce a generation that's equipped physically and socially to deal with the rapid environmental decay that we've inflicted on this poor planet. And every deaf ear that people have because of capitalism is another death knell for us all.
Thank you, Jude. Gary, I'm going to ask you that question now. And Laurie, you're next.
Okay, wasn't quite ready for that, but I think that we really have to resist fear. I mean, it's important for us to be conscious of our safety and our need to defend ourselves. And unfortunately, we have to waste more time on that because of the fascist right wing. But I think it's really important for us to continue to build our movements and to rely on our communities and our movement organizing, and to resist these attempts to have us sort of go and hide out from these people. And I do know that that's actually entered into some of the organizing processes around certain events in Sudbury about, like, if we make this public, if we call for a public action, are the fascists going to be there? Are they going to beat us up, right? And we need to take proper precautions around people's security and organize to defend ourselves, because we cannot rely on the police. We know that the police will more often than not side with the fascists, as they've been doing almost all the time in terms of recent actions. And it means that we have to actually continue our movements. I'm just going to mention one example. This comes from the United States, and I'm sorry to have to use this example, but I think it sort of dramatizes things. When the fascists and right-wing, white supremacist Trump supporters were organizing to invade the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., there were initially plans on the part of Black Lives Matter groups and anti-fascists to organize a mass public assembly that would physically stop them from being able to do that. When those plans were announced, the Democratic Party and liberals went into action, preventing those people from basically being able to do that. Now, just imagine what would have happened if Black Lives Matter and anti-fascists had actually stopped those protesters and prevented them from being able to get to the Capitol. It would be a very different situation that we'd be facing. So we need to rely on our own organizing and our own struggles, and to continue to take the initiative, and not to be afraid, even though we need to be very conscious of our security and our safety. And there are ways we can defend ourselves, right? There are ways we can organize without ever relying on state institutions and the police. And I think that's really where we need to move. And it takes different features in different places, right? It'll look different in Sudbury than in North Bay or Sault Ste. Marie or Thunder Bay or Toronto. But we need to start to organize along those lines. And I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. Our friends, the small L liberals, keep getting in the way. Laurie, I promised to ask you this question next. What have a rise in extreme right-wing capitalism or neo-fascism altered the narrative of activism in northern communities?
Absolutely. I think it has. And again, I will just quickly go back to Mike Harris, but because I think that the Mike Harris government was the closest that we've had to a actual fascist government in Ontario. And I remember very consciously at the time that people weren't speaking, that suddenly there was a sense that you couldn't speak, you couldn't do anything because you were going to lose your jobs. You were going to be punished in some real way. And it was tangible. You could feel it, that people were holding back. And I don't think we've ever recovered from that in Ontario, to be perfectly honest. So I agree with, and of course, what we're facing now is different. We're talking about organized hate groups. And I think what Gary is saying is very real. We need to be careful about fear, but at the same time, as a white woman, I am very, very conscious of how my activism could be putting other people in danger. And so this is something that we have to be very aware of, that you know, of course, I'm not going to speak for other people, but I also have to be very, very careful about how I frame my activism these days, that I am not I'm not setting other people up as the target for these hate groups. So yes, as Gary says, we need to not let fear guide us, because that is absolutely what these organized hate groups are trying to do. At the same time, it's very difficult because that's why they're effective. And so again, we have seen online harassment of LGBTQ two-spirit people here in Sudbury. I myself was getting brown envelopes delivered to my door after I helped organize the first, it wasn't a Black Lives Matter protest, but it was a rally around the death of Floyd George. And so, you know, I certainly didn't feel threatened, personally threatened by these envelopes. This was obviously a white person who was trying to get me back on side. But if I had been a person of color getting those envelopes in the mail, I would have felt very, very threatened. So again, my standpoint and who I am has become very, very important in my activism in terms of how I strategize, how I'm going to go forward. I will just leave it there, but I think that fear is something that we definitely do need to talk about in this community, and how we're going to protect each other in very deliberate and hopefully effective ways. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Laurie. Well, you're going to close this question off. Can you tell us how a rise in extreme right-wing capitalism, neo-fascism have altered the narrative of activism here in the North?
My mother married a Frenchman because she knew it wasn't going to benefit her and her children if they were Indigenous. This isn't just a new thing. This has been going on since contact, that there is this avoidance of, as Laurie and Gary had said about that fear, is that as an Indigenous person, and the more dark an Indigenous person is, the more they are a trigger for those neo-fascist capitalists, because they are a reminder of what they are doing wrong, what they are violating. Like I said earlier about being a Canadian citizen in Canada, if you're in Canada, okay, Canada is on Indigenous land. And when Canada has been asked to show title, they can't. So if you say you own land in Canada and you're not Indigenous, well, debt's due. But that is scary. So not decolonize, we have to unsettle the settler mindset, because we have to understand you're not in your home, and it's bad form to behave the way you are in someone else's form, someone else's home. And that is where neo-fascism is that they are dealing with trauma generationally because of the wars. That is the core of their value system. So what we need is healing. That many of these individuals that are reacting the way they are is because they're scared too. They're scared. Not that us who are not neo-fascists are also scared. It's recognizing that it's the core of the fundamental conflict between two people. And in Canada, before European arrival, we had that understanding between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, and that coming to war was not going to help us. And there was a treaty called the One Bowl, One Spoon Treaty. That was the simple premise of those two coming together, sharing and feasting from one bowl and one spoon, and each taking turn to share with each other. The other was the Iroquois Confederacy, when they talk about burying the hatchet, those weapons of war, in order for that tree of peace to grow. And at the base of that tree is where those weapons are. And so when we bury those tools, what I'm telling non-Indigenous settler people and neo-fascists, you need to go back to school and learn, because that's the core of neo-fascism and racism, is that you are ignorant. You are not knowing. You are unknowing. You don't know. Because you are ignoring, ignorant, you are ignoring the knowledge, the information, and the other, then you are a racist. And when you weaponize that racism, you're a neo-fascist.
Thank you, Will. Our producers tell me that there are 5 minutes left to question period. So I'm going to head right to the last question. And I'm going to give you fair warning. Laurie, Will, Jude, and Gary, in that order, if we can be quick about it. What is the role that Black Lives Matter Sudbury can play in the Northern context, specifically to address the mainstreaming of racist and extremist voices and extremist groups? So, Laurie?
Well, I think the first thing they can do is just exist and just be here. I mean, having Black Lives Matter in this city has revolutionized activism in terms of a lot of what we're talking about. There's now a very strong base for organizing against, certainly against racist fascism. So just existing and just being here. And again, you know, we're here to stay, baby, is absolutely the message that needs to come through. You know, we're not fucking around anymore, and we're not playing around, and we're not playing nice, and we're here to stay. And I think that obviously that is what triggers this hate. Obviously, we can see, but that's what has to happen. And so, of course, you know, again, when we first, you know, in June, we tried to start a group called, oh gosh, I just lost racial justice, first around racial justice, but it's around basically settlers and white people organizing around racial justice. And again, I think we need to, and of course we felt at the time though that Black Lives Matter was more important, and it was more important to let that shape, and it has been amazing. But I do think we need to go back to looking at how settlers and white people can organize around, around these issues as well. Because it's important to have Indigenous and Black people and people of color out there organizing, but it's also important for all of us to understand how we need to also stand with them in, and protect, not to protect them, but to stand in solidarity.
Thank you, Laurie. How about you, Will?
I agree, and I think that's the core, is recognizing as an Indigenous person within this community, the more that stand with us, the more our voice becomes amplified. But where the key challenge is in the same way that a police officer won't admit when he makes a mistake, a politician won't admit when they make a wrong error in judgment and decision and policies. And the same thing goes for educators, is that when they got it wrong, it takes generations for them to make the change. So now we've got Indigenous, now the Black Lives Matter. We need a revamp of the full education system, not just here in the North, but globally. I would say start here, but let's think globally, because the curriculum that is fundamentally in the schools has perpetuated these neo-fascist ideologies, because the content that's in there is, well, let's just say black and white. It's simple to the point where who it promotes and supports. And when we see, like, for something so simple as a chapter on the Holocaust and a paragraph on the residential school. So these are the complexities of the content and the resources and the methodology. So Black Lives Matter, Indigenous peoples in the North. Okay, education, guess what? You've been called. Now get to move.
Well put. Jude, how about you?
Personally, I believe that people on an individual level who are fully committed to conservative ideals aren't possible to reach. It's a kind of anti-intellectualism and anti-democracy that roots itself so deeply that any attempt at bridging that gap, no matter how rational or how placating it may be, will be seen and reacted to as open hostility. Our educational system and our media are so powerfully allied with oligarchy that I don't believe it's possible for us to manage to successfully change minds or whatever. I think that Black Lives Matter and similarly oriented organizations should focus on creating safe spaces, both metaphorically and literally, for marginalized groups to exist in, and guarding those spaces against literal and rhetorical invaders. I believe that Northern society is at a tipping point, kind of accelerated because of this whole pandemic thing, and our focus should be on trying to survive what I believe to be an inevitable catastrophe, rather than trying to avoid it in futility.
Thank you, Jude. Gary, you're closing us off. What can the Northern Intersectional Caucus and BLM do in the North?
Okay, well, I'm basically sort of riffing off or bouncing off what Laurie was saying. The group that you were thinking of was Showing Up for Racial Justice, which exists in Toronto and many other places, and it does fantastic work. And it's largely white activists organizing to respect and follow the leadership and initiative of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but taking responsibility as white people for actually addressing settler colonialism and racism as our problem that we actually have to mobilize around. So I completely agree that the most important thing that Black Lives Matter Toronto, Sudbury, sorry, forgot my place right now, that we can do it here in Sudbury is to actually continue the global uprising against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and police brutality. And that uprising is still going on. This caucus is part of that. So the organizing needs to go on. Just remember that, you know, a couple of years ago, defunding and abolishing the police would have been a very marginal position, but now masses of people coming into the streets have made this a popular demand. The final thing I wanted to also mention that we always need to recognize that questions of safety and violence and racism affect us all in different ways, and we need to understand that. I'll just relay one thing that was common in Black Lives Matter Toronto protests a number of years ago, which was if the police turned up and were trying to arrest Black people, white people would surround them. Not simply in terms of trying to protect them, but understanding that white people were using their relative privilege in that situation to actually ensure that the police would not be able to arrest Black activists. And I think that sort of is a really crucial thing for white people to show up, to stand up, and to take responsibility under the leadership and direction of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to fight racism, white supremacy, and settler colonialism. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Gary, and thanks to the panel. We're heading over to our Q&A right now, and our first question was asked by two, both Vanessa and Anonymous. And the question is a long one, and let me say that Will, Laurie, Gary, and Jude, we'll do it in that order. And the question is this: are you also concerned about the wolf in sheep's clothing tactics by these groups? I see groups trying to gain credibility via helping our vulnerable populations. In Sudbury, we are seeing former Soldiers of Odin members, and they are possibly still members, we don't know, organizing services for people who are unhoused or underhoused. We know some of them open to shelter in the absence of sufficient shelter spaces and are gaining support and popularity in the community as a result. What are some strategies you suggest for organizing against these types of initiatives, whose purpose seems to mostly be to further entrench white supremacy in our community at the expense of a very oppressed segment of our community? So, Will?
The white paper that was put out by Jean Chrétien and Justin's father, Pierre Trudeau, back in the late 1960s, early 70s, was countered by Indigenous communities as with the red paper. The white paper was ultimately attempting to eliminate status to Indigenous peoples and make them full citizens, citizen plus. But the problem with that is that they were getting a lot of Indigenous lawyers or Indigenous leaders to try to pitch and sell this idea to Indigenous communities, when in fact it was ultimately it would have removed the rights and the responsibilities of the Crown to honor Indigenous peoples. And ultimately, because the goal was to get the land and to get Native people off the land so they can continue to do what they've been trying to do since then. And Laurentian currently, with their attempt to try to develop Indigenous programming at Laurentian, ignores the Federation. And the oldest school in Northern Ontario was the University of Sudbury, which has an Indigenous studies program, which they've continually neglected to assist and support, but they wanted to develop their own to ultimately eliminate the Federation so they can have all the Indigenous students. Why? Because there are more Indigenous peoples becoming into education. The demographic is growing among Indigenous peoples. There's money to be made. And so this is where the key is that they are pitching to local Indigenous peoples to pitch the idea, to sell the idea. Let's create Indigenous programming at Laurentian, but not telling them, forget the relationship ongoing for over 50 years that in Native studies that Indigenous peoples have had. And these are the complexities that are there, is that we don't see. It's the smoke and mirrors. The wolf in sheep clothing, they're everywhere. So we have to recognize, we have to vet and check, we have to question everyone. And that's what Indigenous people have had to do since contact. So wolf in sheep's clothing, I have to be careful. Wolf is my clan. And if I see a wolf, I'll bite your head off.
Thank you, Will. Laurie?
Well, yeah, that's actually a very pertinent question right now that resonates because I'm involved with a coalition that's looking at poverty and homelessness in Sudbury. And yes, we are now caught with a former, or as far as we can tell, soldier of Odin, who is started a shelter. The city has closed it down, but what has happened, of course, is now this person is gaining all of this support in the community as the champion for the homeless. And it is a very difficult position because again, we don't have clear evidence that this is what's going on right now. And we've had people paying attention. So, you know, obviously, I think if we would have caught this before, I think that it would have been more, it would have made more sense to try and nip this in the bud as soon as it started. But there's no doubt that this is absolutely a tactic for these right-wing and right-wing white supremacist, misogynist groups to work with marginalized people who are vulnerable. And of course, they then use that as a recruiting tool to pull people into their movements. So I think what we need to be better at here in Sudbury is recognizing that they're there, right? They're in our community and they are organized and they know what they're doing to some extent, although they're often not very smart. But at the same time, we need to be aware of the danger that they present because we are now in a situation in Sudbury where, yeah, we're sort of stuck. If we take on this guy, we're going to lose. Right? We're going to lose in terms of public opinion right now because he is seen as this champion of the homeless. So absolutely, we've got ourselves in this position here in Sudbury that we need to be aware of. And I think that the only way to, one of the ways to avoid it is to be more aware of it from the very beginning and try to stop it. Because at this point, it's absolutely, obviously we can still deal with it, but it's gotten away from us at this point, yeah.
Thank you, Laurie. Gary?
A couple of things. The far right and white supremacists have actually appropriated from the history of the Black Panther Party to serve the people parts of their program, which is really quite disgusting and despicable. But they are using it as an organizing strategy fairly systematically in a number of different places. So this is a real threat. And it does pain me, having been involved in the Sudbury Coalition Against Poverty for a long time, which unfortunately no longer exists, that if SCAP, the Sudbury Coalition Against Poverty, had still been around, we probably would not be in this situation. It would have been seen and it would have been organized against at a much earlier point. But I think the other side of this is that it also means that we need to do our own mutual aid, social solidarity organizing. Part of that's growing out of responses to the pandemic, but we actually need to extend that as part of the organizing that we do. So in that sense, maybe we need to reclaim the Serve the People part of the Black Panther Party program and start to organize these programs ourselves. I know we can't do everything, but that might actually be a way of undercutting them, to actually, first of all, expose who's actually doing this and why they're doing it. They're doing it to try to build legitimacy and support for white supremacy and fascism, but to also produce alternatives that are so much better that it just sweeps them out of the situation. So I would strongly urge people to actually, not just expose them, but to also figure out, can we develop actual alternatives that will meet people's needs in a much better way and that will empower people and that will not actually construct this sort of white savior notion in relationship to people living in poverty, but actually is about organizing and mobilizing and building a movement of people living in poverty who often are Indigenous and racialized, especially in Sudbury, to actually organize to create a society in which poverty can actually be ended, right? That we can abolish poverty, right? Anyway, I'll stop there. Lots more could be said.
Thank you, Gary. Jude, close it off for us.
I think that Gary hit the nail on the head. it's easy to emotionally get invested in the idea that we should be policing the politics of whoever it is that creates a very small solution for homelessness. But I believe that the wolf in sheep's clothing, the whole part of that smokescreen is in the idea that now we're fighting over who does and who does not create a temporary solution of homelessness. And the reality is that homelessness is an effect of our economy, of the way our society is structured. And I think that rather than asking, why is it that this group is doing a homeless shelter and this group is not, we should instead be continuing to ask, economically speaking, why are there homeless people? Why are there empty apartments all over this city and there are still homeless people? How do we as a society continuously just sort of accept that that's a necessary consequence of the way of the lives that we live, despite the obvious rational reality that it doesn't need to be that way? I don't think it's possible for us to stand up and say that guy shouldn't do a shelter because his politics are bad, which of course they are, without looking like we're now against the idea of the solution that, regardless of his other politics, is unfortunately a good thing. I don't necessarily support this person or the groups that they're a part of, obviously, but I do think that that entire debate is itself a smokescreen. It's to distract us from the economic reality that we're all in that same boat. I don't want to assume, but I don't think any of us on this panel are wealthy, and yet we've probably all given significantly more time and effort and money to groups that help homeless people than a significant amount of the people who would claim to be against homelessness, but otherwise do nothing about it. And we have to stop and question why the people who have the power to change this kind of economic reality simply choose not to.
Thank you, Jude. We have our next question from the Q&A, and it'll be our last one before we wrap up. And a fair warning, Gary, you're going to tee it off, followed by Will, Jude, and Laurie. And the question is as follows. Neil asks, the fight against racist, fascist, and hate groups often feels like a no-win situation. We know what to do, we know what to say, yet in the time it takes to dismantle one of these groups, 3 more will spring up out of thin air. And Neil's question is, what can we do to suppress these destructive ideologies on a more fundamental level when logic and nuance are mostly ineffective? Gary? Okay,
so quickly, I mean, I think the work that some anti-fascist groups do, basically doing counter surveillance on these right-wing white supremacist and fascist groups is very, very important, but it's also very time consuming. And I think that needs to be combined. That's important work. It needs to be combined with continuing to build our mass movements, our social movements, our class movements, our movements of for racial justice. All of these movements need to continue to be built, because in some ways, why these groups are able to develop and grow is because of the weakness of our own organizing, right? We need to not simply focus on them, although that's important. We need to also focus on building our movements, because our movements are what hope and optimism comes from, right? And we need to provide people with hope and optimism about things can actually change. Like, there's all sorts of forces out there that want to curtail our notions of hope and optimism, right? They actually want to say, well, you can't do that. That's unrealistic. You know, you can't actually provide housing for homeless people. You can't actually end poverty, but we know we can. We know that people in the past have organized and been able to do these things. So I think that it's important for us to put that more limited form of anti-fascist organizing focus on, let's say, on the Soldiers of Odin or the Proud Boys or the Yellow Vests, in the context of building a much broader movement that actually gets at the social roots of where racism, fascism, and white supremacy come from. So, and I think that provides us with hope and optimism, because I think we know out of our struggles that we can actually build a new world, a new society, which is not defined by colonialism, white supremacy, racism, or poverty. I know there's a lot more that could be said, but I don't have any more time. Thank you.
That's okay, thank you, Gary. Will, you're next.
The time that I spent in the armed forces was that I was as a medic, and the reason why I became a medic was recognizing there was healing that needed to be done, healing within myself, within my family, within Indigenous communities. But at the same time, I can't heal you if you don't want to be healed. But Indigenous peoples continually are patiently waiting, the way grandparents are continually waiting for their teenage kids to grow up. And that's what we have to do, is that these groups are themselves underinformed and trauma experienced, so they need to be heard. There's healing. That is the solution. Not one group against another group and another group and another group, because then all it does is it creates the war of that Western view. We need to come together with paths to healing, and some of that is uncomfortable. Marie St. Clair says that in the TRC, in the calls to action, that the calls to action that could confirm that Canada has a history of genocide against Indigenous peoples. And these calls to action are for Canadians to get together and do this change, for institutions to make these changes. But guess who's doing the work? Not Canadians. Indigenous peoples are leading those calls to action. So that tells me something. You're not ready to heal.
Well put. Thank you, Will. Laurie, you close off the last Q&A.
Okay, well, I think I'll just go back to what Gary was saying, is that we need to keep and we need to get better at building our movements, and it's because it's there that yes, hope comes from, and the alternative comes from, because as Will is saying, there's a lot of generational trauma, there's a lot of trauma going on, and people are latching on to answers, what they think are answers. If our movements aren't strong, if we're not presenting strong alternatives, if we're letting this, white supremacist foundation literally shape where we're going to be heading, then of course we're not going to win. And I will use the word win, because I do think that this is a war. I do think that there are groups out there that are very consciously and very deliberately fomenting these hate groups because they have a very clear agenda. And so we need to be aware of that. And yes, we need to build our own capacity, but we also need to be aware of when these groups start to pose a danger in our communities, and when their poison starts to infiltrate, we need to be able to stop it as soon as possible. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Laurie. I see by the clock on the wall that we have, we're at our time, but we have about 30 seconds apiece for closing comments. So Will, Laurie, Gary, and Jude, would you tell us your quick closing comments?
Education. Like I said earlier about the ignorance, when we are ignoring the information of the other, then we are the ones that got work to do. So as soon as we make effort to be aware of another, then we bring about that healing between us. At the end of the day, if that is not the effort, that's the work. That's what we need to do. We need to learn, educate, become aware.
Thank you. Will, Laurie?
Oh dear. I guess I will just riff off of that education piece just by quickly reminding people that two of our current neo-fascists, Orbán in Hungary and Bolsonaro in Brazil, one of the first things they did when they came into power was they canceled the women's studies and the oppression studies courses in their universities. First thing they did. So absolutely, education about power and about oppression is something we need to continue, whether it's through formal education or through our activist work. So I'll just, and I really appreciate this discussion. I think that we need to have more discussions about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Gary?
Yeah, I think this discussion has been really important, but it's just a beginning. So I hope there's other contexts and venues in which it can continue. I think that we need to talk about education and popular education. I think we need to talk about people learning from history and from resistance. That's something that is always missing from official forms of education. So we also need to talk about the character of education that takes place. We need to build our movements. We need to recognize that we need to hold on to radical hope and optimism and notions of radical love and caring that come out of mutual aid and social solidarity. And that I know that we all together can actually build a world defined by Black liberation, Indigenous liberation, and liberation for poor people, and getting rid of this racist capitalist society. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Jude, you have the last word.
Yesterday, I saw a social media post from a well-meaning friend of mine that said, canceling someone won't help them grow. Humiliating someone won't help them be better. If you're a would-be ally watching this, looking for advice on how to be more active, here's my suggestion. Do not believe in the myth of cancel culture. Have you heard the phrase, listen to Black people? Let Black people determine when someone struck out, instead of letting white people hem and haw over how many swings they should be allowed.
Thank you for that, Jude. And thank you to all the panelists and our producers and our signers, and thank you to our audience. A short video is coming up to close us off and take us to the next session, and take it away.
Reuben and all our panelists for cultivating such an exciting discussion. I sincerely hope that everyone enjoyed themselves. As a reminder, keep an eye open for our follow-up survey and an opportunity to be entered for a chance to win a prize pack of items showcasing the beautiful art of our caucus artist, Sonia Ikator-Katimi. After a brief break, we'll be back with Parce qu'on vient de loin, panel francophone sur l'immigration at 1:30 p.m. For Northern Caucus information, please consult our virtual event booklet and stay tuned to our social media. Thank you again to our sponsors, Cambrian College, Canadian Mental Health Association Sudbury Manitoulin, Centre de Santé Communautaire de Grande Sudbury, Centre Victoria pour Femmes, Collège Boréal, Galerie du Nouvel Ontario, Greater Sudbury Public Library, Laurentian University Université Laurentienne, Public Health Sudbury and Districts, Réseau Access Network, Société Alzheimer's Society, Sudbury Action Center for Youth, Thornhill University Women's Gender Sexuality Studies Department. And remember, Here to Stay Baby is not only the header of this event, but a battle cry for marginalized communities residing in Northern Ontario. Our lives have value, we belong, we are here to stay, baby. Thank you for joining us and have a splendid rest of the day.